Daniel, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to carry out this interview with you. So you are a technology consultant.
That's right.
You are a Forbes contributor, advisor to governments, and author of 8 books.
Yes.
What I would say, you're a futurist too, right?
Yes. So my focus is mostly forecasting and strategy. My background's been working not exclusively with government, but analyzing trends for government analysis. And a few years ago, I switched to the private sector, and now I'm working at the interface of government and the private sector around strategy and forecasting.
All right, that's great. So Daniel, we're entering a time of high disruptive technological innovation.
Yes.
There are a lot of industries that have been disrupted as a result of technological advancement. We're going to have a look today at 2 major industries. Let's have a look at the energy sector.
Okay, sure.
It's such a slow-moving industry.
I would distinguish between the fossil fuel industry,
Yep.
which is a couple centuries old and reaching sort of the last phase of its maturity cycle, and clean energy or renewables, which are just beginning their takeoff. And I would say that clean energy has been, up till recently, quite controversial because of expensive costs and the feeling that it's politically motivated. And mostly what that's about is a lot of resistance to disruption, because there's concerns about vested interests that have their political and economic power based in fossil fuels, specifically oil. Whole industries, whole economies are built around the oil sector. And so anyone who is a part of that and has built their careers, livelihoods, and political capacities on it clearly don't want that to change. Having said that, if we just step back from the debate itself and look at just the technological dimension of it, the fact is that solar and wind are declining dramatically quickly. I'd say probably the forecasts are that by 2030, solar could be and will be the cheapest energy source in the world. The next question that builds on that, I think, is about storage. So that's a question about batteries. Batteries are moving a little more slowly. But the fact is that what accompanies a shift from fossil fuels to renewables is also a shift in the infrastructure that supports production and consumption. So with fossil fuels, namely oil, you have centralized systems of production and consumption. You have monopolies overall. With clean energy, it's probably not going to be the case. You're going to have distributed energy systems. In the midterm, if you're from a developed country, you're going to be using grids. Those grids that used to be one-way grids, passive consumption, are going to be two-way smart grids, in which you'll have a significant amount of sensors and machine learning that support the way energy is managed. And I think in the long term, particularly in emerging economies, you'll see off-grid distributed energy systems that build on disruptive technologies that may already be nascent or yet don't exist, that haven't been invented effectively.
Okay.
And so I think that it's going to transform how we manage energy, but how we live as a society as well.
Exactly. I was going to say just that. So it means that if we adopt both solar panels and battery energy storage, this will completely change the way we buy and consume energy, right?
Right. So, there was a time when monopolies were necessary, both for questions of cost, efficiency, scale, economies of scale. I think, if energy is pulled out of the ground, right, and needs to be transported long distances by ship, then of course a centralized infrastructure has value. If energy is pulled from the sun or wind or other renewables, it's not an issue of monopoly anymore. It's not cost effective. It's not efficient. It doesn't make sense logically. But because we have come of age in an era of energy scarcity, and because we've depended on monopolies for centuries, our assumption is that clean energy too will have to fit that kind of logical frame of reference, and it just won't. In the short to medium term, as we use grids to manage electricity, I think that we'll still have something like monopolies. There'll be room for managing. It may not be as closed systems of monopolies. Like I think that some companies can provide consulting services that are value added to the systems that are being displaced. But all that aside, we're entering an era of distributed energy systems, which will be different. Yeah.
Okay, this is a very good blend between environmental goals and technology.
Sure.
But solar panels are still very expensive.
Relatively speaking, they're more expensive, but they're probably equal with coal, and every 10 years you're seeing a decline of something like 80-90% in cost.
Okay.
Now you add to that the other sort of gorilla in the room, which is China. China is now the leading developer of clean energy technologies, and because China has so much capacity for economies of scale, it should impact the market. It should accelerate the speed at which clean energy technologies are made available. So, as I said, the major forecast is that by the 2030s, solar will be the cheapest energy source available, cheaper than shale oil, cheaper than other fossil fuels.
That's great. We consumers are getting more preoccupied about climate change issues.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that these issues and concerns are putting pressure on the energy sector? And how do you see it changing over the next 5 years?
There's no doubt there's pressure on governments, pressure on consumers, pressure on natural resources, pressure on capitalism as a system of economic development. But I think the energy industries are bifurcating between innovative sectors that are looking at renewables like Tesla as the future of economic growth, and vested interests within the fossil fuel industry that are afraid of what will happen to their livelihoods. I think that fossil fuels will remain a transitional energy system throughout the next 25, 35 years. But there's no doubt that clean energy is the direction we're going. Another way of putting that is there's hard trends and soft trends. The hard trend is we're going to clean energies regardless of the speed or regardless of the cost or scale or scope. The soft trend is how quickly it'll occur,
Right.
who will lead the change, which countries will be dominant.
Right.
One analogy I always like to think about is, England or Britain was a coal empire. The United States was a oil empire. It's possible that if it's China's time, there'll be a clean energy empire. I don't know if it's a one-to-one shift. I think we're probably living in a much more polycentric world. I think the U.S. will be a superpower for many decades to come. But and it's also the case that because clean energy is not centralized in the same way that fossil fuels were, that it could have impact on geopolitics as well, which is an interesting thing to speculate on. But regardless, I think whichever countries are the most proactive in developing the technologies will benefit the most over the long term, because these technologies will continue to evolve, they'll continue to become cheaper, and they'll provide an abundance of energy that can be delivered through entrepreneurial and innovative industries that haven't been invented yet.
Right. Okay, that's great. You mentioned artificial intelligence earlier. How do you think artificial intelligence can help the energy sector?
So the distinction I always like to make is between AI and machine learning. Right? There's a lot of confusion in people's minds because they're afraid of the consequences of cognitive machines that could displace human labor or human industries. I think what we're talking about with machine learning is basically pattern recognition, and then systems that are deployed through algorithms to automate practices and processes that human beings otherwise would have done. And so in that sense, if we're looking at a clean energy infrastructure managed by sensors and machine learning, we can automate a tremendous amount of that work. And so that could provide us with abundance of energy coupled to automated systems that would provide opportunity for innovation. There's a guy named Jeremy Rifkin, who's a very astute analyst. He talks about an energy internet, this idea that just like we have the World Wide Web for communication and commerce, we'll have smart grids, two-way energy flows between producers and consumers that will allow us to revolutionize how energy is managed. And there's no doubt machine learning will be a huge part of that.
So basically, this is the case that energy companies need to fundamentally rethink their business models and digitally transform to better build value propositions, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are different kinds of energy companies, obviously, or energy industries. If we look at Saudi Arabia, I'm not sure they're going to be able to transform themselves from an oil economy to a clean energy producer. I don't think that's likely. So it's probably in their interest to think about the way UAE has, think about alternative industries they can build on using that oil revenue now so that they're prepared when it runs out later. If you look at the utilities, for example, in advanced economies, they can have powerful value add in terms of consulting and working with local providers and leveraging their resources, connecting them to the smart grids that are being built. There's a lot of opportunity for conversion. The problem is that, by and large, vested interest companies that do things well have a hard time making the shift because they have become so complacent in some respects with regard to the pace of change.
Right.
And they underassume how quickly technologies accelerate. And that's why startups are always so effective, right? Because they're able to measure that curve more effectively and be prepared when the takeoff occurs.
And they're also more agile.
Exactly. They're smaller.
So I believe that with so much disruption affecting this industry, companies really need to take this wake-up call and start disrupting the way they interact with their customers.
Right. There's a lot of consultants in the world now who are trying to work with large corporations to help them understand how they can disrupt from within. And that can be very effective. The problem is shifting gears from the corporate executive authorities that validate mandate change and enabling sort of the new innovative components of those organizations to deploy the necessary resources to make the change. So it's a difficult thing to manage.
Very difficult, absolutely. Yeah. And it doesn't just happen overnight, it might take years. So Daniel, another sector that is experiencing a major wave of disruption is the retail sector.
Right.
This has entered a phase of avid technological innovation. Mm-hmm. For example, Ocado, the English online supermarket, has implemented high-tech powerhouses. Tesco, another supermarket, they are implementing facial recognition for verifying customer age. And this is great for companies, but what does it mean for human labor?
Okay, so again, this is a disruptive shift in which value add comes from somewhere else. So initially the value add might be the service industry, the service that the human staff or employee provides. I think that if you look at retail in specific, like if you look at clothing, for example, mm-hmm. and this idea of a smart mirror where you can try on clothes without actually physically trying clothes on, they're not going to necessarily need the same kind of staff, right? It may be that the kind of staff they're looking for are people that are not just selling clothes, but selling a story, selling a narrative, right. Sort of like what Instagram does or the users of Instagram provide. Retail is changing because there's more power among users now, both to critique and criticize and also to select. And so I think what's happening in the retail industry is a shift from the retail industry knows best and you consume to the user knows what they want and the retailer must adapt. And so that's in a sense bringing lead users into the value chain and mixing that up with technology.
Does it mean that technology in the retail sector is replacing the human interaction for delivering a better service, a most accurate service as well?
Yeah, I don't fully know the answer to that. I think on the surface I'd say yes. There's no doubt that technology is going to displace labor. Having said that, there's always opportunities for human touch to provide a kind of value add that a machine just doesn't do, right?
Right.
But I don't think that it's something that we know the answer to yet. I think it'll be a question of experimentation, new retail models that look for the convergence between offline and online buying and selling. I think that, so for example, like something that comes to mind right away is a lot of people go to the store to try on something, but they don't buy it there, right? So what they might do is pull up find an item they like, pull up an app on their phone, purchase it there, and then go home and have it delivered. So you have this bridging of these online, offline spaces that are counterintuitive, right? Yes. But they're both needed in a sense.
Customer expectations have increased so much as a result of technological advancement. And this is great because artificial intelligence is helping a lot in this by delivering personalized experiences and services. Mm-hmm. Many retailers are going out of business as a result of the rise on e-commerce stores.
Right.
How do you think artificial intelligence is going to help retailers to regain trust and tap into tech?
Well, again, that's also a question of disruption. So some companies that can make the shift, recognizing the value that technology provides versus the value that human high touch provide, those companies will be much more successful over the long term. Having said that, companies like Amazon that are so effective in capturing new verticals and deploying internet-based or digital resources in complement to on-the-ground stores, they have a certain advantage, right? Because they're remaking industries that have been mature for some time. Retail is a mature industry. Having said that, I think the question is about experimentation for sure, but it's also about tapping the consumer and finding out what the consumer is not just looking for, but would drive the consumer to go to a retailer as opposed to purchasing online, and finding out how you can more effectively converge the two, online and offline sales. That's sort of the issue. It's not just bricks and mortar versus .com. It's about having a presence in both spaces and about leveraging both in a kind of complementary way. I think that's the big difference.
It looks like retailers are using these new technologies to win the customer experience battle, right?
That's right.
But we shouldn't really lose sight of humanity. But it looks like in this non-human world, the customers want more human interaction rather than less human interaction. How are we going to manage that?
Well, I think it's not that they want more human interaction, they want more quality human interaction. So in other words, they don't want people getting in the way of their exploring. They want them available when they need them. And so I think that if you're doing price comparison on an item or a good, by and large, you can do that online. You're not going to do that in the store because you're not going to find the cheapest price that way. But if you're nervous about whether the shoes look as good in reality as they do online, you may want to try those shoes on in person. So I think that having some kind of high-touch value add on the ground in complement to online, then I think there'll be opportunities for the retailers to take advantage of. But again, it's not just a question of whether you have a website and you have a storefront. It's about how those two complement each other.
Of course, absolutely. So AI is really helping retailers and other businesses to leverage the technology to provide better customer and shopping experiences across retail and e-commerce stores as well.
Well, what machine learning does very well is find out, using algorithms, the most efficient ways to manage processes at the cheapest price point. So in that sense, it does what humans are not good at doing, right? AI or machine learning more specifically is productive precisely because it accelerates the speed at which efficiency occurs.
Apple has deployed Apple Payments.
Right.
It doesn't really seem to be taking off, right?
Right.
Do you see ourselves paying entirely or completely with our phone in the future?
Well, we pay with credit cards more often than not now. So that's a digital form of payment. There's the struggle to develop a kind of virtual currency like cryptocurrencies that sort of ebbs and flows in terms of credibility. But I think looking at experimental models, I think you're probably better off looking at China, looking at Asia, where they don't have the banking infrastructure deployed, where they can use QR codes and the phone to provide efficient access to bank accounts, checking accounts, and credit. So I think that the developed world is mature in terms of its financial institutions. The emerging world, because it lacks much of the infrastructure, whether it's energy or retail, has the need to experiment. And I think that's where you're going to find new business models around finance and around banking. And I think that just like I was going to say with regard to disruptive industries and disruptive established institutions, the banking industry is notorious for not offering very effective or high quality service.
Yes.
And I think that there'll probably come a time when large corporations like Amazon or Facebook could provide an equivalent service that a bank provides. And I think that they may be better at creating value-added retail touch-point experience than the banks have been so far. Or there might be a convergence of the two forces, so that you have like the maturity of the dot-coms companies with the banking sector, one doing the back-end database and an infrastructure on money, the other doing front-end value-added customer service. I think there's probably something there too.
So looking back at artificial intelligence, we talked about personalized experiences and that artificial intelligence can really understand a customer in a more accurate and faster way, right? It doesn't really seem that people are so happy about these new technologies because it's getting a little bit too creepy. You're obviously very comfortable about technology. I'm comfortable about technology. I worked in NEC facial recognition before, but many people are not that comfortable about it. When do you think we will be comfortable with all these new robots around and technologies?
I don't think we're ever going to be completely comfortable with advanced technology, simply because they feel alien to us, because they're outside of us. Having said that, I usually try to consider a caveat, which is that instead of looking at artificial intelligence as an alien force, think about it as augmented intelligence. So it'll augment our own cognitive capacities. If we have interactivity with machine learning and AI in a way that feels seamless, whether it's voice or visual signaling or it's direct brain connection, I think then we'll feel we have more power over it. Having said that, there is a follow-on question that relates to what you're asking about surveillance, which is about how to develop societies in the AI era. So countries like China, which are more centralized and more technocratic, tend to have populations that are more comfortable with surveillance systems than in the West within democracies that are forever concerned about how governments can exploit or take advantage or misuse data, right? I think that it's an unavoidable problem because the more data made available, the better we train algorithms, the more effective they become, the more magic they can do, right? So it's an organic process. I favor, for example, blockchain or distributed ledger technologies, developing systems that can house data more effectively in a more protected way. Now, whether that is blockchain or DLT is a different question. But the point of the issue is that data is a universal, it's a given. This is where we're headed, this is where we are now. How we manage data at a policy level or at a legal and regulatory level, that's yet to be determined. And that's a lot of work that's in front of us for China and every other country as well. And I think that is good reason to be concerned. That's not a naive feeling or fear. The reality is that data builds a profile of every human being, and if that data is misused, those are human lives that can be exploited. So it's incumbent upon governments to adapt and evolve, right? Whether they use the academic world or they use research centers or corporate R&D. There has to be a lot of work done around managing a data-driven society. And one of the challenges for democracies is that democracies, by and large, which are discourse-driven, are too slow to figure out how to manage data-driven societies. And I think that it's going to be real pressure on democracies to figure out how to redesign themselves in the AI era. Whereas countries like China and some more technocratic societies like Singapore, they're just better, more efficient at it. They can do it more easily. And to their credit, anyway, it's a real concern. I'm not as at ease about it as you might think, but I do recognize the inevitability of it. It's not like you can stop the process of AI and data.
In terms of consumers, consumers don't really like machines to check the buying history and the preferences. I know that these machines are actually shaping better shopping experiences in the retail sector or e-commerce sector, but we don't really like machines to know much more than
we would like them to know.
Yes.
Right. So the European Union has tried to provide a means, and probably will continue to do this, a means for users to control their own data. I think that's pretty necessary. Having said that, there's a deficiency in enabling user control of data when data is exactly what's necessary for algorithms to evolve and grow. So countries that have weaker data protection systems may develop AI at an accelerated pace by compared to countries that don't. So it's a very tricky contradiction, freedom versus evolution, and I think that's something that strategists, legal scholars, government, and consumers have to figure out over time.
Great. Daniel, thank you so much for being here today. You've been a great guest.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you have any questions, please comment below and I'll be happy to answer all your questions. Thank you very much.